My friends challenged me to build a deck tech where every single card, including the commander, was under $1. Not to mention, you guys absolutely destroyed the like button on my last Coram video, getting over 900 likes, which is insane. So I figured 2 birds, 1 stone. I'm gonna get you guys an awesome Coram budget list, and then additionally, I'm going to create a monster of a list that will smash my friends in this little competition we're having. And that's what I call efficiency, and that's what we're all about on this channel. Now, the first pitfall I kind of fell into is I tried to build it the same way as my non-budget version, which it became very apparent that that was not going to work. My non-budget version treats Coram like, you know, maybe just a sacrificial lamb. This guy gets cast instantly to get sacrificed and thrown to the bin. He's a good little trash man with a shovel that just likes being in the trash. And then when he goes to the trash, he just so happens to draw me a ton of cards, generate a ton of mana, or even mill me a ton. Now, a lot of the cards that enable this strategy are just not budget, so we had to pivot. And then once I got onto the mindset of Coram is friend, not food, I was able to bang out the deck pretty quickly, and again, it ended up being a monster. The strategy I stuck onto was including all of the creature cards that get their power based off of how many creature cards are in everybody's graveyard, and then we're just going to mill our opponents to an oblivion, and our Coram is going to get massive. This is where having him on the battlefield is going to be more beneficial than him just being a dirty little trash man that stays in the trash, because he's able to attack, mill our opponents, we're able to cast those spells, and he's just going to be more flexible, and he's going to ensure we're not missing any of our land drops. Another thing that's really good about having him on the battlefield is there's actually a lot of very budget tutors that just throw something directly from your library into the graveyard. So you can cast one of them, and then you just throw whatever you need to cast into the graveyard, and Coram allows you to cast it. So the toolbox this guy gives is insane. We're running him more of a Jund Paco Haldan instead of just a Coram sacrifice list, which again ended up being a solid mid-range deck. Another thing that kind of came out of left field and started to add to the mid-ranginess of this deck was a Lifegain strategy. Yes, I turned this into a Jund Lifegain deck. Who would have thought? All I was doing was throwing in synergistic cards that cared about creatures' power, and it turns out along with drawing you a ton of cards, they also just gain you a ton of life. So I leaned into that to the point where Command the Dreadhorde became one of the win cons of the deck. It already synergizes with us milling our opponents and putting a ton of creatures in their graveyard, which is what this deck wants to do anyway, so adding it as a win con was amazing. Not to mention the life gain portion of the deck ended up being a huge problem for my opponents. Once you become the problem and you've got a ton of extra life, it turns out all 3 of them can attack you, and out of nowhere you untap with more life than you lost. Kind of insane, but again, just adds to the ability of this deck to go mid-range. Let us not forget that the longer the game goes, the more powerful our deck is going to get. We're gaining life, we're milling our opponents, and the more creatures they mill, the stronger our deck is going to get. Not to mention, it just sets us up for that giant Command the Dreadhorde. So in short, we're going to cook these guys. Last but not least, let's shout out the high contributing patrons. Newsome and Irrelevant, you guys rock. Now let's get into the rest of this deck tech. The first thing this deck wants to do is get Coram on the battlefield, and then we need a massive creature in our graveyard. Necrogoyf, Lurgoyf, and Multivore are going to be perfect. These scale really good into the late game. Titanorex is probably one of the best cards we can see in our opener because it's super easy to cycle, and then we have a massive commander with Trample. Splinter Fright also works in a pinch, but 9 times out of 10 we'd probably rather cast this just to have a massive creature and a solid way to mill more cards. Souls of the Lost, again, really good in the late game, and even in the early game, it's probably going to be bigger than our Lurgoyf effects because they take a little bit to get going. So Souls of the Lost early game is going to be amazing. Deathbloom doesn't exactly make our creature massive, but it does synergize with the fact that we're trying to get as many creature cards in our graveyard as possible. Bladewing Deathless Tyrant also synergizes with this fact, and honestly, it can be a solid game ender in this deck. The next thing this deck's going to need as soon as possible is a mill engine. Shigeki Jukai Visionary is personally my favorite. It has consistent mill, it's a little bit of ramp, and then also if you mill something that you need to get back, you can channel it to get it back to your hand. Cemetery Tampering is also super solid here. It mills 3 cards a turn, and then you do get that very flexible hideaway ability. Mindwreck Harpy is one of the best mill engines in this deck because it mills everybody, and let us not forget that some of the creatures that get Coram massive in this deck care about how many creature cards are in everybody's graveyard. Not to mention, Mindwreck Harpy can really set up for a massive Command the Dreadhorde. Nyx Sweeper, again, just some consistent mill, and then additionally, it can bring cards back from the graveyard. Tato Farmer, I really love this guy. He's not only ramp, but he also does give us those radiation counters that allow us to mill even more cards. The glowing one is super underrated in mill decks. This guy gained me a ton of life. The fact that if we get a Mind Rack Harpy on the battlefield, we have an opportunity to gain upwards to 12 life a rotation, assuming those are all non-land cards, it can gain an insane amount of life. Not to mention, there is other mass mill effects in the deck, like One Ring to rule them all. Getting this off with a glowing one on the battlefield is going to gain you an insane amount of life. I also think One Ring to rule them all is also just an underrated card in general. The fact that this mills every player equal to the Ring Bearer's power is insane, especially in a Power Matters strategy that wants to mill everybody. And then the second one destroys all non-legendary creatures. So everybody's gonna lose their board, but we're gonna keep our biggest creature, which is Coram, on the battlefield. This can kind of set it up to where we can commander damage someone out, especially if we get one of those Lorgoyfs in the graveyard. And then the last one, each opponent loses 1 life for each creature card in that player's graveyard, also synergizes perfectly with the deck, and it kind of puts our opponents on the clock. They have to deal with this saga or just die. Bramble Familiar is super simple. It comes down early as a mana dork, and then late game it can mill us up to 7 cards and cheat our creatures into play, so we love that. Vault 12 is honestly expensive for 6 mana, but I'm giving it a shot in this deck. One, it's budget, so we can try out these new wacky cards, and then additionally it gives everybody 3 rad counters, which is a total of 12 rad counters and 12 possible creatures that we can get into everybody's graveyard, which is good. And then it does generate an instant board state equal to the amount of rad counters everybody's is left with whenever we untap on our turn, the very next turn, and then it's going to buff that board state up. So it's definitely got some solid utility here, and it can generate us an instant board state along with milling our opponents. Screeching Scorch Beast is another pseudo win con in this deck. This deck can mill a ton of cards from our opponents, and then now whenever we're doing that, we're generating a massive board state. It's going to be pretty hard for our opponents to come back if we get this guy to resolve. The Grim Captain's Locker has too much utility not to use. It has Surveil, which is kind of mill, kind of not mill. It works for Coram, and that's all we care about. Also, it is going to give our creatures escape, and it's going to actually reduce the cost of most of our creatures that we'd want to cast anyway. Like our Screeching Scorch Beast is only going to cost 4 mana now instead of a total of 6. After that, we have our Tutors of the deck, which most of our Tutors just grab cards from our library and throw them directly into our graveyard, but that does work with Coram, so it still does count as a tutor because we're able to cast it that turn. Buried Alive, Gravebreak Lamia, and Lively Dirge are perfect for this because they just grab whatever we need, put them in the graveyard, and then we can cast them using our commander. Last but not least, we have Old Stick Fingers. This one isn't really a tutor and it's not really mill, but it does work for the deck because we're guaranteed to get more creatures in our graveyard, which is all this deck is really trying to do. Let's talk about some of the Power Matters payoffs we play in this deck. We have Bio Orner, Rancher, and Alina. These two are perfect. They're just going to allow us to tap for mana equal to the biggest creature on the battlefield. Alina is a little more restrictive because the creature has to have entered the battlefield that turn, but remember, all of these Lorgoyfs are going to get massive in the late game, and they're super easy to cast for either 4 or 5 mana. So along with our commander, we do just have these massive creatures in the deck that are very useful to the strategy. Not to mention Mr. Rancher over here has an ability where you can sacrifice him to gain life equal to the greatest toughness among creatures you control, and those Lorgoyfs again are going to have massive toughness as well, just adding to our life gain synergies in the deck. Tunaki Transplanter, just equip this onto our commander and add a ton of mana to our mana pool whenever he attacks. Disciple of Freelease and Disciple of Bolas, these are amazing in the deck. They enter the battlefield, you sacrifice a creature, you draw cards equal to that creature's power, and then you gain life equal to that creature's power. So more life gain synergies and amazing card draw options. Mask of Grizzlebrand, kind of the same thing. You equip this to a creature and it now has lifelink and flying, so evasion for our commander. Additionally, whenever that creature dies, which we do have a few sack outlets in the deck, like I don't know, maybe Disciple of Bolas, we can pay life equal to that creature's power and then draw that many cards. Greven, Praetor's Captain, another way we can kind of synergize with our life gain synergies because this guy makes us pay a lot of life. But In return, we get a ton of cards and a massive creature. This guy says whenever Greven attacks, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, draw cards equal to the creature's power, and you lose life equal to that creature's toughness. So amazing in a Coram deck when Coram has massive power but only 5 toughness. It's just kind of perfect here. And then additionally, Greven gets plus X plus 0, where X is the amount of life we've lost this turn. So he just hits like a truck. Return of the Wild Speaker is also amazing here, but you have to be careful when you use it because you draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control. Coram is a human, so make sure you're doing this and you have a Lorgoyf on the battlefield or anything that's literally not a human. That way you actually get the card advantage. And then it does buff up your massive board of zombies. This deck can go super wide with a bunch of zombies, so it can kind of be a game ender in that scenario as well. Altar of the Wretched is actually a win con in this deck. Not only is the front side of this amazing, it enters the battlefield, it's going to draw you cards, and it's going to mill you a ton. Not to mention, once we craft this guy into the Wretched Bone Mass, this guy just wins games. His power and toughness is going to be equal to the power of all of the cards you use to craft with him. So if we throw a couple Lorgoyfs or even a Souls of the Lost in there, this guy can easily be above 40 power. And then we look at the several ways we have to end the game once we have a 40 power creature. You know, we've got your Warstorm Surge effects, we're playing Zeatora. Any fling effect is just going to kill a player. Additionally, this guy has all of the keywords of the cards that we exiled. So as long as we exile something with haste, he can attack immediately. So all we have to do, make sure he has trample, make sure he has haste, kill one player with his massive power, fling him at the other player, and there's only one player left and you can easily take that guy out. Psychosis Crawler seems like a weird include, but it's honestly one of my favorites and it ended up being a no-brainer in this deck. Once we look at all of our mass card draw options with Altar of the Wretched, we have our Disciples of Freelise and Bullisk, Mask of Grizzlebrand, and even Greven. All of these cards are going to draw us cards equal to our commander's power, essentially, right? And it's not hard to get Coram to over 40 power in this deck. So that's just going to kill the entire table if we just so happen to sacrifice our commander to a Disciple of Bullisk whenever he has above 40 power and we have Psychosis Crawler on the battlefield. Another reason I like Psychosis Crawler in this deck is even if it gets in the graveyard, we know Coram's power is always going to be equal to our hand size. So whenever we cast a Lorgoyf and we sacrifice that Lorgoyf to draw a ton of cards, Coram's just going to get massive. Not to mention, if Psychosis Crawler is on the battlefield, Psychosis Crawler is just going to be massive. Scepter of Celebration is an amazing card that not only gives our Coram trample, but additionally, whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you create that many 1/1 green-white citizen creature tokens. So now not only are we killing people with Coram because now he has trample and you can't chump block him, additionally we're creating this massive board state and we're going to become the problem pretty quick off of this. Wind Swift Slice is another card that I had no idea existed, but I'm super happy to start including this in decks. This is kind of what happens when you have to build these challenge decks where you use cards that are under $1. You just find these hidden gems. And this one says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. Create a number of 1/1 green elf creature tokens equal to the amount of excess damage done this way. So when Coram's 20 power, we can easily just snipe a 1/1 and boom, we've got 19 elves on the battlefield. Not only is that going to set off our Warstorm Surge effects, but additionally, it's just going to get rid of our opponent's key pieces. Zeatora the Incinerator, this is a little bit of a slow card that I think reads better than it plays, but in these budget challenges where we have a lot of time to set up our board states, Zeatora is going to be one of the factors that puts us ahead of our opponents. It's going to snipe down their key pieces while generating us value, and that's going to ensure that our late game is going to be stronger than our opponents. Corpse Explosion is a super flexible card in this deck. We can kind of form some one-sided board wipes. Now we can exile a card with 2 power from our graveyard, and that's going to get rid of all of the 1/1s if we're getting opponents that are going wide, or we can just exile a card with 18 power and wipe the entire board. I love the flexibility here. Let's wrap it up by talking about more win cons and some key pieces. We have Sir Conrad. Now there's a plethora of different ways this guy can win us the game, especially with the amount of mass mill in this deck. Not to mention Command the Dreadhorde and a Sack Outlet probably gets you there as well. Ogre Battle Driver and Chainer Nightmare Adept are just going to allow us to give all of those creatures we're reanimating haste. It would really suck to cast a massive Command the Dreadhorde and then pass the turn and have to try to win the next turn. I'd rather just win right then, right there, after we catch our opponents off guard. Champion's Helm and Mirror Shield are amazing here. They give our commander hexproof, and protecting him is going to be pretty key once he starts getting massive. Too greedily too deep is another way we can pseudo wipe the board, or we can go ahead and make it a full board wipe depending on whatever we want to reanimate. So there's a lot of flexibility here, and it's just an amazing reanimation spell. Goreclaw is going to be amazing here. Not only do we get trample, but we are reducing the cost of all of those creatures that have power 4 or greater. Neheb Dreadhorde Champion, an amazing way to not only draw cards and fill our graveyard, it's also going to give us mana. That's going to do it for the deck tech, guys. Thank you again for 900 likes on my other Coram video. If you guys want to check that out, I'll leave the link right here. It has some solid options for some upgrades while sticking to the theme of this deck, so I definitely go check that out if you're wanting to upgrade this deck and have it be a little more powerful. Additionally, guys, if you guys want to like this video, if you love the work I do, a like goes a long way, and it's super free to do, and I really do appreciate it. With that being said, I will like to shout out my patrons, Newsome, Praetor, Excessum, Irrelevant, and Chicken Salad. You guys are amazing. As always, I hope this helped you in your deck building endeavors, and I will see you guys in the next one.